Hi.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. This learning lab was planned jointly by Jeff Lois and myself and Bezawit Kesa and Shelley Suttenberg, who are listed here. And Jeff is going to start us off. And he's muted.
18 months into this crisis, and I still forget. Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today for this exciting learning lab. As Ed already mentioned, I'll start us off, and then you'll hear from Ed and Beza and Shelley later on in this session. Today's session is about randomized controlled trials of complex interventions in agriculture, nutrition, and health. Introductions have already been made. Just wanted to mention that Ed and Beza are from the University of South Carolina. Shelley is from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and I work with the International Food Policy Research Institute. So today's session has three parts. We will start with an interactive part where we would like to know from you what questions you may have related to RCTs, randomized controlled trials of complex interventions. We will then talk a little bit about the use of RCTs for impact evaluation and move to the specific use of RCTs in agriculture, nutrition, and health. We'll then take a break, and after the break we will specifically address some issues that come up regularly in these trials related to outcomes and the challenge or the issue of multiplicity. And we'll end this session with enough time for questions and hopefully answers from all of us. So, as I mentioned, we would like to start by taking a minute or so, maybe 2 minutes, 3 minutes, to hear from you what questions you might have as they relate to randomized controlled trials. And we're not just asking for any questions you may have. We would specifically like to hear about questions that relate to conducting randomized controlled trials for complex agriculture, nutrition, and health interventions. You can add your questions, comments, concerns to the Zoom chat window right now. And Bezawit, as we continue this learning lab, will summarize these comments and questions, and we will return to what you shared with us at the end of our session. Okay. So please feel free to think about this and add these to the chat, and Bezawit will harvest your input from there. All right, so let's start with the use of RCTs. And before we move to the specific of RCTs, let's step back a little bit and talk a minute or so about impact evaluations. What is the impact of an intervention? That's ultimately the question we would like to answer in impact evaluations. And there's two ways on this slide that we present this. The first is an equation. If you don't like equations, you can simply focus on the graphic below it. The impact of an intervention is the outcome you measure. It could be diet or a specific behavior, or the yield of a crop, or the amount of milk a cow produces. So it's that outcome if that unit you observe has received the intervention minus the outcome for those who did not receive the intervention. And it's the difference in outcomes for those who receive the intervention and those who do not receive the intervention that is the impact of that intervention. So in the graphic below, you can see we have an intervention, you could say, involving livestock, chickens and cows here, and we're interested in the diet of that child. So we have a group receiving the intervention on the left, we have a group not receiving the intervention at the right, and we're interested in assessing the diet of the child. Now the key challenge is that we cannot observe that outcome in the same individual. We can never know what the diet is in a child when it receives the intervention and the outcome in that child when the child does not receive the intervention, because a child will either be in the intervention or not in the intervention. And that's the key or the central problem or challenge in impact evaluation. So to solve that problem, we need to use a counterfactual. And a counterfactual is basically what would have happened in the absence of the intervention. So what we need to do is think about a creative way to assess what would have happened with this child's diet if the child had not received the intervention. And this is where randomized controls come in. So what we do is we have a number of children here at the bottom of the slide. We have an intervention group on the left. We have a control group on the right. So the intervention will receive what we have in mind in terms of livestock. On the control will not receive it. And we flip a coin to decide which child will be assigned to which group. And if you do this well, as you can see, you will have a nice balance of children in the intervention group and in the control group. And looking at just one characteristic here of the children, take a look at the color. You can see that the reddish children, 2 of them are on the left, 2 of them are on the right. So we've now created groups where not all the reddish children are in the intervention group or in the control group. So using an experimental design, flipping a coin, this is what we call a randomized control trial, is considered the gold standard for impact evaluations. And if we do this well, we can assume that the two groups, the 2 arms, are comparable, that the only difference between these 2 arms must be the intervention. And as a consequence, the control arm now provides a valid counterfactual. It gives us the information that we needed to have, as in what would have happened with these children if they had not received the intervention. This means that if all of these things are done correctly, that the differences you find between that intervention group and the control group must be due to the intervention we implemented. We do know that experimental designs or randomized control trials are not always feasible. It's often challenging to implement them. Many of these challenges or barriers can be overcome with some creativity. There are solutions like oversubscription, organizing public lotteries, delayed interventions, stepped wedge designs, and so on. And if those are not possible, there is also a number of quasi-experimental designs. And rather than assigning individuals to randomly to a control or a treatment group, those often use statistical techniques to create a valid comparison arm. And techniques there include propensity score matching, double differences, regression discontinuity, and so on. Today, however, we will just focus on RCTs. And we know that there are questions about the adequacy or the appropriateness of the use of RCTs for impact evaluation. That's an interesting and relevant discussion, but that's not the discussion we want to focus on today. So today, we will look at RCTs and answer questions that relate to RCTs to evaluate complex interventions. I wanted to highlight that, but I forgot to click on the slide, so there it is again. I'm now handing over to Ed.
So we wanted to just develop a simple example with you, and we'll use this in a couple of different ways throughout the discussion. So this is an example of a randomized control trial that was done. It was the first of 2 studies. This was the smaller study that was published first, and then this provided justification for a much larger study that's being analyzed and reported now. And this shows the theory of change, or the program theory, or the theoretical framework, however you want to talk about it. The idea was in Western Kenya, near Lake Victoria, that there's the population there is at fairly high risk of getting HIV, and we know that there's plenty of evidence to suggest that people who are of limited means and are food insecure have more difficulty managing their HIV. And so the idea of the intervention, if you look on the left, was to say, okay, if the intervention provides loans that then provide the means for obtaining a handheld or foot-driven irrigation pump and some agricultural input, then with proper training, that that package of interventions together, each of those boxes has other boxes, different components, and that would lead to improvements in household wealth and in food security, which would then have an impact on gender empowerment, which is at the bottom there, and also through three other paths, through improving adherence behaviors to therapy for HIV, better mental health, and better adequate nutrition, and that those would lead to decreased HIV morbidity and mortality, and also reduce the risk of transmission. So this was the theory of change, and each of the boxes there that you can see, food security and wealth and empowerment, etc., are what we can refer to as constructs. So we're going to now develop the idea of constructs and then tie that to the notion of outcomes. So if we can go to the next slide. So if we think formally, what's a construct? A construct is just simply some phenomenon of theoretical interest, some part of reality that we care about. And we assume that the phenomenon is real. So we assume, for example, that food security is a real thing. It may be directly observable. We can go out and look at it and see it, or it may be unobservable, or what's called latent, where we have to then use some other means to make it visible to us. And the relationship between a construct and an outcome is that the construct leads to the outcome. So we think about an outcome representing a reflection or a manifestation of the construct. So we're emphasizing this because outcomes are measures that we take, but we want to measure what reflects the outcomes that we care about. So next slide. So this leads us to the group work that we would like to engage us in today. And so we have 4 questions for this breakout session that are based on the study that we just talked about. So the 4 questions are, first of all, given what you know about this trial, where the intention is as I described, what would you want to learn from this trial? So in your breakout group, maybe you can just write out 1 sentence that you can share about what you think you would most want to learn from this trial. The second question is, what are the constructs that you think are important that you would need to measure? What are the constructs that are important and that you would therefore want to measure? So we need a list of constructs. And then which of these constructs do you think are most important, what we might call primary outcomes? So which are the most important constructs, and therefore we need to have representations of those as outcomes that we put our focus on. And then fourth, just one word, how difficult is to you do this exercise? So 4 questions. What do you want to learn? What are the constructs that you care about? And then which of those is most important? And then finally, how difficult was the exercise? So next slide. Okay, so there's a PDF file, 1 page that you can find at this link. The link's also been put in the chat box for you. So that will show you the theory of change and also remind you of the questions, so that when you're in breakout room, you have access to those. And then you'll be assigned to one of the breakout rooms. You don't need to do anything. It'll happen automatically, magically. We're suggesting that the breakout sessions be 15 minutes, and then you'll be brought back automatically. And we ask that you identify 1 person who will be the reporter. And then when we come back from the breakout rooms, we'll ask to have brief reports of your responses to those 4 questions. Okay? So Hallie, you can go ahead and launch the breakout groups. I think 5 groups will be fine.
Sure, thank you. And I also wanted to mention that everyone should please use the link shared in the chat box to access the resource for this breakout group. All right, I will open the rooms.
Welcome back, everybody. Okay, so that was quick work. It'll be the shortest planned study ever. So we realized the time was constrained, but we'd like to hear sort of what you came up with. So maybe if the first group could have its reporter just quickly tell us what you discussed in terms of the 4 questions.
Ed, is the table, am I sharing the table now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Group 1?
Group 1.
In case it's helpful, it looks like group 1 was Ayami, Bharati, Diego, Emily, Belia, and Ivan. If any of you want.
Yeah, so for the first question, sorry, difficult to see. Like to learn from this plan. So what we want to look for the first question, we saw that there's so many pathways to the final outcomes, and so we want to know the impact of all the intervention components through the pathway. So that should be clear. That's what we wanted to know from the diagram. So what's the impact of all the intervention components, and that should be clear through all the different pathways. So that was the number 1. And then what constructs will you need to measure? So for the constructs that we need to measure, we realized that a risk-taking behavior, that would be more difficult. It feels like a construct, but the HIV, morbidity, and mortality are things we can directly measure. So we thought about those. And then which of these constructs should be represented as the primary outcome? To be honest, we didn't get to that. Yeah, we didn't get to the two last questions because it took a while for us to discuss the first 2 questions. Yeah.
Okay. So can I conclude that it was difficult then?
Yes, very difficult. Yeah. Very difficult.
Okay, great, thank you. Group 2. Allie, maybe you can remind group 2 who they were.
Sure. So group 2 was Christine, Damaris, Leah, Lila, Molly, and Natalie.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, I couldn't remember which group we were. So for what we would like to learn, we honestly couldn't come up with one single question. So one question was similar to the first group, which is understanding the mediation pathway of the conceptual framework. So doing some sort of SEM model or understanding how much of the variance is explained by this model. But also, can agricultural interventions impact HIV? A bit of an impact evaluation. For constructs, we felt in order to analyze those questions that we needed to measure all the constructs. And for our primary outcome, we chose HIV mortality and morbidity. We did not get to question 4 either.
What would you say it was, Natalie?
Fairly difficult, yes. Yeah, we had a lot of discussion.
Okay, thank you, Natalie. And group two, group three?
Yeah, hi everyone. So I think I'll start with question number 4. We as a group felt it was difficult because we did not have an idea of the context in which the trial was implemented. So we had to make a lot of assumptions about the things, the changes that were depicted in the theory of change. So for question number 1, we wanted to know like what was the relative contribution or importance of loans and credits in achieving the HIV related health aspects, and how food security was related to medication adherence, and whether these interventions improved access to finance of the household so that they could buy medicine and then adhere to medication intake. So and the other thing that we wanted to know was for the agricultural interventions to bring about a change in the HIV outcomes, then the health services or HIV services had to be really strong in these areas. Otherwise, it would be very difficult, for these changes to happen. For question number 2, we thought, the things that were listed on the theory of change itself were constructs like food security, mental health, nutrition, women's empowerment. Even the gender empowerment was mentioned there, we thought women's empowerment would be a better construct. And as far as our outcomes, again, like group 2, we also thought morbidity and mortality were important. We also thought transmission would be one of the outcomes, because Kenya, is one of the high burden HIV, so transmission would be really high. And then, in terms of financial construct, like, household wealth or household income. So these were the outcomes that we discussed in the group. Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. And then group 4?
So group 4 was that last group. It looks like Diana, Lily, Noel, and Simone.
Okay, I think we didn't agree who will present, but since the notes are with me, I think I'll give it a try. I also wanted to start with the first question, and it was very difficult. Definitely, you need more time to discuss all the pathways, and we're stuck a lot with the first question. And I'll try to add to what was already said. So one of the things, was already mentioned, understanding the context. So for example, how the healthcare system, of course, it will be the same for the intervention and the controls, but we would like to know like how that interacts with or affects the intervention. So that will be like understanding a little bit more of the context. And something to add to what was already said was also the need to collect qualitative data. We would like to know like how people perceive the intervention, how the acceptability that the intervention had. And then something to add to that was also how participating in intervention interferes with adherence of people to the ART. And then we thought that pretty much everything on the pathway can somehow be treated as primary outcomes also, like women's empowerment and yes, and we agreed also that those are constructs that we will need to see how to define and measure. If there's anything else that someone wants to add.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, just a few observations before we go on. So we're going to pick up from here and sort of use this experience to sort of help motivate where we're going. But I think one of the things that I was observer in group 4, and group 4 generated a lot of questions that only some of which are represented here. And I think that as a number of groups pointed out, that everything in the theory of change is of interest, and those constructs and paths are important. There's also seems to be a little bit of a tendency, in spite of that, to focus on morbidity and mortality, which were the endpoints of the change, the theory of change. So that's something we can come back and talk about. Jeff, any observations you want to make?
No, I think those summarize it very well. And I'm very happy that people said we needed more time and we need to understand context and to do this well. I think that's good to hear.
Okay, so with that in mind, then why don't we move forward? We're going to just talk a little bit more, and then we'll take a very short bathroom break before we continue. So we wanted to highlight what makes, why are we even having this learning lab, and why are Jeff and Bezawit and I, with guidance and support from Shelley, focusing on issues about randomized controlled trials for complex agriculture, nutrition, and health interventions. And so we thought it would be helpful to just differentiate evaluations of non-complex interventions with complex interventions. So in non-complex interventions on the left, we often most often are focused on efficacy, the idea of if everything is implemented exactly the way it's supposed to be, what kind of a benefit can we generate? So the focus is on a well-defined, often single intervention, something like an antibiotic treatment or a micronutrient supplement. And the outcome, what we're looking for, the effect that the impact that we're hoping to see represented in an outcome we measure is narrowly defined. So it might be preventing the number of days ill, lowering that, or altering micronutrient status. Whereas in contrast to that, in a complex intervention, we're usually interested in effectiveness, meaning what is the impact in a real world setting, accounting for all of the things that can happen in a real world setting where we don't have complete control over exactly how everything is implemented or how it unfolds. And so we're often looking at interventions that are composed of more than one intervention component, often many different intervention components that could include behavior change communication and gender sensitization. It could include biological inputs like micronutrient supplements. It could include cash transfers and a number of agricultural inputs. So a number of different components together. And we're interested in how that set of intervention components affects a wide range of outcomes across different constructs, as we've just seen in the example that you were discussing. So the next part, in a non-complex intervention, not always, but typically there's a solid understanding of the biological mechanisms to even bring the trial to being able to be implemented and being justified. There needs to be a biological underpinning for what's been proposed. In contrast to that, in complex interventions, it may be often that the exact biological and behavioral mechanisms by which the intervention will have an impact is not known. We'll have a theory of change like we were just discussing, but we may not have all of the evidence to prove that, which mechanisms are most important and how exactly do they work. We may have evidence from some other studies that some of those paths certainly do work, or we could expect them to work, but we don't have everything nailed down. And oftentimes in the intervention, in the study itself, we're looking to see which of the mechanisms is most important and to add to the evidence base about that. So we don't have all of that necessarily nailed down. And so we have an interest then in estimating effects on a wide range of outcomes, as you just discussed. Those outcomes are linked to the objectives of the intervention and to the constructs that we think are important. And there's intermediate outcomes along the theorized impact paths that are important. So especially in the second study that was done in Kenya using the same theory of change, we've discussed in the study team the importance of measuring intermediate outcomes, and knowing that whether or not the intervention affects food insecurity, or whether it affects empowerment, or whether it affects mental health is very important, along with does it have an effect on the endpoints, which are often the health endpoints. And we know that if we limited the number of trial outcomes to only one or just a very few, then that would run the risk of missing important results. That would run the risk of missing understanding what this investment in doing this trial might yield in terms of understanding. Okay, so and then finally at the bottom here, for non-complex interventions, there's long-standing guidance that's been developed by Consort, by the Food and Drug Administration in the US and UK agencies and many others that provide very useful recommendations for conducting these trials. And a lot of that guidance is built around the importance of transparency, and that transparency is important because we want to avoid conflicts of interest, particularly economic interests, with the trial, conducting the trial and its reporting and the integrity of those. And so, for example, if drugs are involved, and the pharmaceutical industry is obviously a really large industry globally, and there's a lot of money at stake in developing a new drug, and companies invest a tremendous amount to even bring a new drug to consideration at this stage. So there's very strong economic interest often in many of the interventions that are of this type. Whereas for complex interventions, what we found, and a motivation behind this work, is that the guidance for non-complex interventions doesn't much of it is, translates, but not all of it translates in the most helpful way to conducting evaluations of interventions that are highly complex, and agriculture, nutrition, health interventions, because of those three sectors being combined together, will most often be complex in this sense. So next slide. So then in bringing this to current thinking, from existing guidance, is that most often the guidance differentiates between two types or categories of outcomes, what are called primary outcomes and secondary outcomes, and then sometimes it gets carried away and talks about tertiary outcomes, but we won't go there. So primary outcomes are ones that are talked about as the only ones that allow the research team to draw confirmatory causal conclusions. And there's this idea that trials should only have one or at most a few primary outcomes. So there should be a limit on the number of primary outcomes. For drugs, often it is only one, that it's brought to this stage of research having in mind one particular outcome. Secondary outcomes are the other outcomes we might care about, where the idea is that conclusions about them are exploratory rather than confirmatory, and there might be no limits on the number of those, but the limitation comes in that all the ones that are secondary are sort of designated as exploratory rather than confirmatory. So I think it's probably easy to see there's some problems with this for complex interventions, including the one that you were just discussing in your breakout groups, that first of all, there's no clear or consistent or meaningful definition of what's primary and therefore what's secondary. No clear reasons why causal inference would be different between outcomes, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. So why, just because you label something as primary versus secondary, should that affect whether or not you can make a causal inference? And then the third point is that there's a strongly held view by many people, but not all, because there's a strongly held view by some others in the opposite direction, but there's a strongly held view that there's a need to correct for multiplicity, meaning doing multiple comparisons, which is costly. We'll talk about what those costs are. And so then there's a tendency to then push to limit the number of outcomes, which may not serve our interests well when we're doing complex evaluations of complex interventions. So those are the issues that we're setting up for discussion. So next slide. Okay, so we're going to take a 5-minute bathroom break. So we ask that you step away from your computer, get up and stretch, do what you need to do, and then come back in a few minutes, in 5 minutes, and then we'll continue.
Ed, you can see the slide again, right?
Yes.
Okay. How do we know when people have come back?
Ask them to turn on their video.
Oh, good idea, Agnes. Thank you.
Well, Jeff, you could lead in a song and see how many voices we get.
Zoom wouldn't do justice to my voice.
Is that what you're worried about?
Yes.
Okay, I think we can begin. So why don't you go to the next slide then, Jeff? Okay, so we wanted to there's a number of issues that we could raise for discussion, but we wanted to focus on the two that we think are the most challenging and other sort of tied to those. So we'll start talking about multiplicity, and then we'll come back and talk about what that means in terms of outcomes, and then how some thoughts that we have about how we can go about this in conducting these trials. So the concern about multiplicity just means carrying out many comparisons. It's been raised in the following context. So we're going to focus on multiple outcomes in this discussion, but there's also issues about many comparisons or multiplicity when we do subgroup analyses. So we want to do separately men versus women, or for rural versus urban. When you have more than 2 study arms, so not just a comparison and an intervention, but there's different types of interventions. When we do initial comparisons that we maybe planned, but those prompt examining other comparisons, building on what we just learned. When we have the same outcomes measured over time and we want to analyze them at all of those different times. And then sometimes when we do interim analyses to see where we are and decide whether or not to continue the trial. So we're going to focus on the first one of those because that's the most sort of difficult. So the next slide. Let's start off with just a basic, simple example that we'll use to try to illustrate a point about probability. So imagine that we have a prison and we're interested in prison safety. Prison safety in this case means that the prisoners that are supposed to be there stay there and don't escape. And so the prison has 5 doors. And so imagine that the probability that a specific prison door fails is 0.01 or 1%. First of all, that's not a very good prison. From having grown up with a prison not too far away, that would not be very comforting, but let's imagine that it's 1%. And then the question is, the safety question is, what's the probability that at least one door fails? Not that any door fails, not that any particular door fails, but does any of them fail, at least one of them fail? And so the probability for that is not 0.01, not 1%. And you can do a simple calculation that's shown there. And the answer comes out in this case that it's about 5%. And so the point is that 1% and 5% are not the same. So here's a situation when, because we have a multiplicity of doors, each of which with a probability of failing, that the probability at least one fails is different than the probability of any particular one failing. Next slide. Okay, another point then that we're going to bring that insight into bear here, that we know from basic statistics that it's useful to talk about what's been called historically type 1 and type 2 errors. So a type 1 error is where we reject a true null hypothesis. So the null hypothesis means that there's no difference. So we imagine, for example, that we have an ANH intervention that does not reduce anemia. We're interested in anemia. And the truth is that it doesn't do anything for anemia. But then we conclude that it does. That's a type 1 error. When nothing's really, there's no impact, but we conclude that there is an impact. That's a type 1 error. A type 2 error is the opposite. It's when we don't reject a null hypothesis that's false. So an example of that is when we had an intervention that truly reduces anemia, but we failed to detect that. And power, the notion of power that we hear about, which is a concept that we use to try to help determine the inadequate sample size, is just 1 minus the type 2 error. So in other words, it's our ability, power is our ability to detect true effects, to find an impact when the impact is truly there. And so in conducting a study, we want to avoid both type 1 and type 2 errors. If there's really no impact, we would like our study to conclude that. And if there really is an impact, we would like our study to find that and to be able to detect that. So we want to avoid both type 1 and type 2 errors. All right, next slide. So let's assume that we want to test one null hypothesis, and we're going to use, for the sake of argument, 0.05, which means that we're going to be calculating p-values and looking around 0.05. And so the type 1 error rate is then 0.05 or 5%. So that means that in 1 out of 20 cases, we would wrongly conclude that there was an impact when it was really not there. So when we say, okay, well, we're interested in a p-value of being 0.05, that's what we're saying, is that we're willing to tolerate that 1 out of 20 times we're going to be wrong in terms of a type 1 error. If we have 2 null hypotheses and we do 2 independent tests, each at 0.05, then using the same math that we used about the prison calculation, the probability of rejecting at least one of those incorrectly turns out to be about 0.0975, which of course is bigger than 0.05. So just like in the prison example, if we had an interest in whether or not we reject at least one true null hypothesis, that probability is bigger than 0.05 because we're testing 2 things that are independent. So in other words, in about 1 out of 10 cases, we'll wrongly conclude that there was at least one impact when there was none there. All right, next slide. Okay, so what we just showed on the last slide is well known, that when a set of hypotheses are tested simultaneously, the overall type 1 error rate, or the probability of rejecting at least one null hypothesis, given that all of them are true, in other words, there's no impact, that probability increases. What's often forgotten is that this particular calculation about simultaneous hypothesis testing assumes that there's a universal null hypothesis that the intervention has no effect on anything, and that the alternative hypothesis is that there's an impact on at least one of these outcomes. All right, next slide. Now, in the theory of change here, that's not what we're thinking about in terms of how, it's not what you were thinking about in your breakout groups about this example. In the discussions from the breakout groups, it was clear that you had an interest, not just, okay, is any one of these boxes, any one of these constructs, is the outcome is the outcome that reflects it, is, you know, we're interested in just any one of them. We don't even care which one, just any one of them. That's not how we think about it in terms of a complex intervention. And so it calls into question the thinking. This is, in other words, evaluating a complex intervention is not the same as prison safety. All right, next slide. So if we apply you know, this way of thinking about it to this example from Kenya, so just simplified for this presentation, that we might be interested in the outcomes that reflect the constructs of food security, food consumption, or dietary quality, and viral load suppression. The null hypotheses would be, for example, that the intervention did not increase food security, that it did not increase frequency of food consumption, and did not increase the prevalence of viral load suppression. And the alternative hypothesis for each one of those is that, no, it did increase food security, it did increase food consumption, and it increased the prevalence of viral load suppression, meaning that the virus is undetectable. In the study, if we were interested in the set of those three hypotheses being tested simultaneously, then we might want to correct for multiplicity. But that correction would then fit the situation that's in the second bullet, which is if the authors had tested the hypothesis no impact on any of the outcomes versus the alternative of the intervention increased food security, or it increased the frequency of food consumption, or it increased the prevalence of viral load suppression. But this joint hypothesis only makes sense if the research defined effectiveness that way, at least one of those three outcomes having changed. But that's not how we typically define intervention effectiveness. And in this study, we're not interested in those three outcomes as alternatives. We're interested in that what's supposed to happen is food security improves, which then affects the food consumption, which the idea, according to the theory, is that will then have an impact on viral load suppression. So that's what we're interested in, and we're not interested in the alternative hypothesis that's here. Next slide. So in the case of this study, the authors concluded in the publication that this multi-sectoral agriculture and finance intervention improved HIV control, food security, and diet quality among HIV-infected individuals in Kenya. So that statement reflects an interest in not just the endpoint, which is HIV control, but in how one got to there, because that's what the intervention was evaluating. The study found, just to be for completeness, the study found no effects on measures of nutritional status measured by body mass index or mid-upper arm circumference, and found no effects through the mental health pathway of depressive symptoms, for example, but did find evidence of increased self-confidence, which ties to the empowerment construct that we saw. Okay, so then why would we not then correct for multiplicity just to be safe? And the answer to that is that correcting for multiplicity is costly. If we decrease type 1 errors, then type 2 errors will increase. So that if we make it easier, if we make it harder to make a type 1 error, then that's going to be at the cost of making a type 2 error. And so the solution might be to then, well, just increase the sample size. So we can test for multiplicity and make the people who want us to do that happy, but we can maintain power by increasing the sample size. But the problem with that is that there's a financial cost, there's a societal cost that's economic, but otherwise, because more study participants are needed, so that means that there's more participant burden. More resources will then be needed, and we have to enroll more study participants to answer the question, and that raises ethical concerns. That's one of the reasons why in some kinds of interventions we consider stopping a study early. If you already know that there's an impact, then why continue the study in some cases? And so that's an ethical argument. So it's really unethical to have to enroll more participants and delay potentially moving into our knowledge something that works because we're trying to satisfy the call for multiplicity when it's not needed. And people who promote multiplicity adjustments do so in the name of transparency, but many of us think that actually making multiplicity adjustments makes it more difficult to be transparent and interpret findings because it's hard to really assess what's been done. It becomes more of a black box of exactly how have the numbers in the end been produced. Okay, next slide. Okay, so then in conclusion about multiplicity, correcting for multiplicity provides in our view, a correct answer, not just our view, the others have written about this, a correct answer to a mostly irrelevant question because research is not prison safety. In the context of our work, we can't think of a situation where correcting for multiplicity is necessary or useful. Transparency, as Jeff will talk about in a bit, is what's really crucial. Correcting for multiplicity doesn't help us get there. And so the bottom line is our advice is to not do it, although we have to recognize that sometimes we'll be forced to do so by a journal editor, which has happened once in my career, and only once that I was forced to do multiplicity adjustments where it clearly wasn't needed because a journal editor insisted. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Jeff now, and he'll continue.
Thank you, Ed. So before people get all excited and think that Ed just gave you a wild card to just measure anything and have no limits on the number of outcomes, it's not quite that simple. Here you see Ed saying that's not what he said. So let's continue and explain this a bit more and refine our recommendations. So in the table that Ed showed before, at the bottom left, there was Ed emphasized the importance of the guidance for non-complex interventions because we don't want economic interests to conflict with the integrity of what we conclude from these trials. So we want to focus a little bit more on that very issue. So this concern is really driven by a concern about type 1 errors. So again, concluding that there is an impact when in reality there is no impact. And the problem is often described as fishing or cherry picking, and the picture I show on the right, I don't need to say it, but I'll say it anyway, it's not cherry picking but fishing. And as you can see, if you count the number of red fish and green fish in that pond, there are fewer green fish, or the green fish represent the outcomes for which we find an effect. And the red fish represent outcomes where no effect is detected. If your paper does not, if you kind of are selective in how you take out the green fish and report on those and do not talk about the red fish, we have a problem of fishing or cherry picking. So it's really selective reporting of outcomes on which the intervention had a significant positive effect. Francis Bacon supposedly in 1620 already reported on that human characteristic that we're moved and excited about affirmatives more than by negatives. So it seems to be part of our human nature. Obviously, it can also be driven by economic gains or academic incentives. It's easier to publish a paper with many statistically significant effects than it is to report on an intervention that seemed to have had no effect on anything we were interested in. But the real concern, obviously, is that it biases our learning. If you selectively share specific findings, the person on the receiving end of that information doesn't know that and would walk away with the wrong impression about the effectiveness of an intervention. So let's decompose this a bit further. So the overall concern is type 1 errors, concluding that there is an impact when in reality there is none. This has led, as Ed mentioned already, to official guidance that is very clear about the need to declare primary, very few, and secondary outcomes. And that's specifically to avoid the problem that people are selective in these outcomes once the results are in. And in addition to this official guidance, there is also informal guidance. We've just used that term, which you will find in the literature. And there seems to be some sort of agreement in our field, in the field of conducting RCTs for complex interventions, that primary outcomes lead to confirmatory causal inference. And what we mean with that is you could make a statement at the end of the trial that is something like, this intervention improved outcome A. And then for secondary outcomes, there is this general understanding that those only lead to exploratory evidence. So it would be something like, the intervention may have improved outcome B. That's what the thinking seems to be like. And as Ed mentioned already, there is a very strong focus on multiplicity correction. Now here are some comments. One is that in the very solid concern about type 1 errors, type 2 errors are largely ignored. So, which means that type 2, again, a reminder, is concluding that there is no impact when in reality there is one. So basically missing true effects. With respect to the official guidance, when you read those carefully, there is no agreement on the number of primary outcomes one can have. The definition of secondary outcomes is inconsistent across these different guidelines. What we've raised already is that limiting the number of outcomes obviously will limit what we can learn from the types of trials we do. And interestingly, the official guidance provides no guidance on causal inference. So these exploratory versus confirmatory is only found in these scientific articles, but it's not found in the official guidance. An important comment here, and we'll try to explain that a bit better on the next slide, is that causal inference depends only on the study design and the integrity of the implementation of the study. It does not depend on the label, whether we call an outcome primary or secondary or something else. That's an arbitrary decision of a researcher or a group of researchers, and cannot have and does not have any effect or impact on, or no bearing on, our possibility to infer causality and the end of the trial. And to make that point clear, this may come as a bit of a surprise to some. To make that point clear, let's do the following, have the following thought experiment. So let's assume that we have a trial of a complex interventions, and we've decided that we want to assess 5 different outcomes, and we just call them A, B, C, D, and E. And we have agreed on one strategy for the statistical analysis, and we have 2 blinded researchers, and in this case this is Ed on the right and myself, Ed on the left and myself on the right. So we both use the same data from the same trial. We've agreed on how we will analyze the data, and we have the same set of outcomes available. So let's start with Ed. Ed looks at this at the trial and registers the trial, and he says, well, for me, the primary outcome of this trial is outcome A. And as a consequence, B, C, D, and E will be my secondary outcomes. When he conducts the analysis, he finds that the intervention had an effect on all 5 outcomes. Okay, so his interpretation following the common guidance is that the intervention had an impact on outcome A, that's his primary outcome, and the intervention may have had an impact on outcomes B, C, D, and E. And what people then say that would need to be confirmed in a new trial. So that's what Ed would conclude. Now, I run my lab independently. I look at the trial, I look at the theory of change, and I say, no, the primary outcome I believe should be B. Okay, so by definition, my secondary outcomes are A, C, D, and E. I use the same exact analytic approach as Ed because that's what we agreed on. So again, I also find that the intervention affected all of the outcomes. But now my interpretation is that the intervention had an impact on outcome B, and that it may have had an impact on outcomes A, C, D, and E. Again, that would have been to be confirmed in the next trial. Obviously, it's very clear that when you conduct one trial, use the same methods, use the same data, that it cannot be correct that we come to very different conclusions in terms of causal inference. And this thought experiment is just to show that this current thinking about confirmatory and exploratory, that it does not make sense, that the labels we assign to outcomes cannot have any effect on what inferences can be made at the end of the trial. So again, causal inference only depends on the study design. The strength of a well-conducted RCT is specifically the ability to conclude that the difference between groups is due to the intervention. And the ability to reach that conclusion is the same for every single outcome we decide to assess. So it doesn't matter if we call it primary or secondary or something else. And it also doesn't matter, and we'll come back to this and put more nuance on this, it is irrespective of whether an outcome was identified before the trial or after the trial. Of course, there's other considerations that we will bring to the table in a little bit. So another way to look at this is that for any fish you take out of this pond, you can say a fish is a fish. It's an outcome from a well-conducted RCT. So if we find differences between the treatment and the control group, it must be due to the intervention. But of course, we still have that remaining problem. We have that being selective about outcomes. So what do we do about that? It's not correct that our paper would show three outcomes that are where the intervention had an effect and one where it does not. When you look at the actual pond, the reality is very different. So that is obviously a problem that we need to address. So here we come to the recommendations we want to formulate. And there's really 3 points here. The first one is that we need to focus on 2 dimensions. The first dimension is declared versus non-declared outcomes. And I will explain that in a minute. And then the second dimension is powered versus unpowered outcomes. And then the final point is, in a sense, a limit on the number of outcomes. The number of outcomes should be based on the program theory and on ethical considerations. And we have several slides for each of these points on this slide. So let me slowly walk you through these points. I will start with the first dimension, declared versus non-declared outcomes. So it is important to register outcomes before the trial starts. We design a trial and before we start conducting the trial, we let the world know this trial is about X, Y, and Z, and these are the outcomes that we plan to assess because these are the outcomes we believe are important to assess for better understanding. So the researcher then can only report on outcomes that were registered before the trial started. The trial findings will then reflect true effects or a true lack of an effect. And what it ultimately leads to is a paper, and you can see it on the right side of that graphic, that more truly reflects the pond where these fishes are drawn from. The solution is obviously only partial, because if you decide to register 10 outcomes and you only write papers about 2 where you found an impact and never report on those 8, we still have that same issue, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. So that's the first dimension, declared outcomes versus non-declared outcomes. The second dimension is our outcomes, the difference between outcomes that are powered adequately versus inadequate. Again, a reminder, power means that we have the ability to find an impact of an intervention that is truly there, that truly exists. What is the problem if we do not power our studies sufficiently? Well, there's 2 important challenges here. The first one is that it is impossible to interpret a null result. And a null result means that we do not find an effect of the intervention. If you have not powered your study adequately and you find no effect, it could be that there is truly no effect, that this intervention has no effect on the outcome you are assessing. Or it could be that there is an effect, but your study was simply not powered to pick up that effect. And it is impossible at the end of the trial to distinguish between those 2. So when you have a null result, you really have no idea how to interpret that. A second problem, which is often ignored, is that when you underpower a study, you will only find very large effects. So it is not uncommon for underpowered studies to still document effects of the intervention. But those, by definition, will be large effects, because the small effects remain unobserved because the study is not powered for that. Now, if you imagine several studies that are underpowered reporting on these effects that are large, when you look at the literature, you will have the impression that intervention X leads to very large impacts on outcome Y, which is not a true reflection of what intervention X can really mean for that outcome. So when we underpower studies, we may contribute to biasing the literature towards saying, well, these effects are large, when in reality they are a lot smaller. Now we can combine the registered or declared and the powered versus unpowered into 4 different possible outcomes. So the first type of outcome is our declared adequately powered outcomes. And those outcomes are powered to detect an impact of a magnitude that is both meaningful and feasible. And that is important. When we say studies need to be powered, we need to know, what do we power them for? And we think they need to be powered for outcomes that are meaningful. And meaningful means that they're associated with a functional benefit or a potential damage that we know about. And it also needs to be feasible. It needs to be in line with what we currently know about what the effect could be of that intervention on this outcome. And just to give you one example, if we did a study and we wanted to look at birth weight as an outcome, if we powered a study and we said we'll power the study for a birth weight effect of 500 grams, 500 grams in birth weight is very meaningful. Okay, that would have a large benefit for those children, but it's not feasible. You need an extremely undernourished population of women to find these types of birth weight outcomes. So it's meaningful, but not feasible. If we set the birth weight effect that we power for to 70 grams, for instance, we would have something that is both meaningful and feasible. And so the power is one part of this set of outcomes. The second dimension is that the outcomes are registered in a public trial registry before the trial is started. The second type of outcome are then outcomes that are declared. So they're in a trial registry, but we don't have adequate power for these outcomes. And now you can say, why would you have these types of outcomes? Well, sometimes we conduct trials and we assess an outcome and we know before we start that we will not have the power to assess meaningful and feasible effects. Mortality is one of them. Why do people still assess these outcomes? Because they know that if several of these trials are then combined afterwards into a meta-analysis, you could still draw meaningful conclusions on that specific outcome. So that's a motivation sometimes to assess outcomes that are not adequately powered. Another is where we sometimes don't know what to expect, or it's very hard to come up with a reasonable power estimation because the outcome is new, or we don't exactly know what impact or what mechanism we might be looking at. And then finally, we have outcomes that are non-declared. Those are outcomes where a researcher says, okay, I didn't think of this, but I want to look at it anyway after the trial has started. So those outcomes are outcomes that the researcher thinks of ex post, so after the trial has started. Now, the most important then is how does this relate, the type of outcome, to the inference that we're allowed to make based on what we find in the trial. So on the left side of this table, we have declared and registered and undeclared or not registered. And then we have two options for the top and the bottom, adequately powered or inadequately powered. And then at the top, we have another two possibilities. Was an effect found, yes or no? And now I'll slowly fill in this table to see what kind of conclusions you could draw. So for the first set of declared and registered outcomes, the findings can be called confirmatory. So if we find an effect and it was adequately powered, we would say intervention X did have an impact on outcome Y. And if we find no effect, we would say the intervention did not have an impact on outcome Y. If we have not powered the trial adequately, then, and you find an effect, you could say it did have an effect, but we should be well aware that the size of what you estimate, what you find, is likely much larger than the average population effect because the trial was underpowered. And if you do not find an effect and you were not powered, then you cannot draw meaningful conclusions. When it comes to undeclared or not registered outcomes, all of the conclusions here will be exploratory in nature. So what I put now at the bottom of this table is similar to what is at the top, but rather than say have, we say may have had. So the certainty around what we find is not as high as when we have registered the trial. And now I'm adding one more layer of complexity here. So this first set of outcomes that are declared and that are adequately powered, this is what we propose should be called primary outcomes. And then all other outcomes that are not adequately powered or not registered are, in our opinion, secondary outcomes. Okay, that was a lot of information. We're nearly there. I just have a few slides left. So on the number of outcomes, we think it's important to emphasize that what you measure should be based on the program theory. You should focus on outcomes the program is designed or expected to affect. As we've said several times now, that omitting relevant outcomes limits what we can learn from a trial, and that's not what we like to see. And we should also not just look at outcomes where we expect to find a positive effect. We should also look at outcomes where we may find a negative or undesirable effect. Ed has already mentioned the ethical considerations. We should only include outcomes that are relevant. And the second big bullet here is that we should only include outcomes that we intend to analyze and publish on. Again, having too many outcomes increases participant burden. It requires more funding, and those funds could be used for other purposes. Once we have measured outcomes, we should all feel that moral obligation to report on those outcomes. Otherwise, you measure them with no good reason. So the bottom line of our presentation, there are 3 key principles to which all trials should adhere. The first one is that the selection of outcomes should be driven by the intent of the intervention and the constructs identified in the program theory. The second one is that trials should be adequately powered for those outcomes. And the third one is that outcomes should be strictly and comprehensively reported as they were planned. So that concludes my part of the presentation, and I will now hand it over to Beza to summarize what you shared with us at the very beginning of the lab. Beza, over to you.
Hello. Thank you everyone for a great turnout. There were a lot of important questions raised, and we have summarized the questions into 4 themes. The first one is intervention or program implementation. 2 people have asked questions in relation to fidelity in ANH trials and how it is measured. Another person asked how lessons from implementation of ANH trial intervention can be used for later programs, can be a scale up or into policy implementation or a replication of trials. Another theme is control groups in ethics ANH RCTs. There were several questions under these. The first is a general question that is discuss the control in RCTs, ANH RCTs, and we have specific questions with regard to control groups. One is issues of ethics and equipoise in assigning participants to the control groups, and if there are any plans to require researchers to benefit control groups after an intervention. Another question was better understanding of control group outcomes for RCTs with outcomes in behavioral or perception outcomes. The third theme was in relation to sample size calculation in HRCTs, specifically in accounting for clustering in clustering in our sample in complex RCTs. The last, next slide, please. The last theme and the one that had the most questions is in measuring and evaluating program or impact of interventions. The first one was how to combine different ANH interventions, which is the case in most of ANH trials, and still be able to measure the individual impact of intervention or component of the interventions. In relation to that, there was a question on how to evaluate them, measure them, and then evaluate the impact of different components of interventions. The third question was about impact pathways, how to evaluate the program impact pathways in ANH RCTs. The fourth question was in relation to heterogeneity of compounding factors in ARCTs and impact pathways, and what would be the best monitoring tool for ANH RCTs, taking into account of compounding factors in pathways. The fifth question was how we assess unwanted or unintended outcomes, especially negative outcomes. The last question was how to balance statistical rigor. I think this ties in all of the above questions well. Which is how to balance the statistical rigor with making context specifically potentially sustainable interventions. We had one last question after these slides were shared. It was about how to do as treated analysis in such complex RCT interventions or ANH RCT trials. So these are the summary of the key questions and concerns that were raised in the first section. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beza. This was a very nice summary pulled together in a very brief amount of time. Thanks. Ed, we didn't really discuss how we would address these, but some of these are more related to today's discussion than others. So do we want to quickly address the ones on the first and second slide and then go to the Q&A? Because I want to make sure we have enough time for question and answers too, based on what we presented.
Yeah, I would say, you know, here just very briefly, the first two bullets on what Beza was showing now, I mean, this is a common question. And, you know, Jeff can comment also. He's done, Jeff and his colleagues have led, you know, trials with multiple arms trying to get at individual versus combined components. And I think that's the only way to do it. If many interventions, including the Kenya one that I showed, there's only two arms, the usual care, the usual situation versus one that's been augmented by a complex intervention. And in the end, we can only say something about whether the combination had an impact, not whether the individual components do. And that's just the way it is. And so those are design choices that we have to make at the beginning.
Yeah, nothing further to add on that one. That's exactly right.
Yeah. You know, in terms of evaluating the program impact paths, I think that, you know, laying out the program impact paths, laying out the theory of change, and then being clear about what the constructs are that are important along the way, and making sure that at least some of the really important ones are assessed so that that analysis can be done. Maybe you can go back one slide, Beza. I can briefly comment on, I mean, fidelity in thinking about implementation is critically important. I think that requires augmenting the RCT with qualitative work, as was pointed out in the breakout sessions. I think on the second point, you know, the issue of ethics, you know, is obviously a critical issue. Very often we're seeing a delayed intervention given to the control group afterwards. That's what we did in the Kenya trial, is that the comparison or control arm, those households then got access to the same thing that the intervention households did, which meant that they were just in delay. I think that certainly people should always be getting the usual care or the usual situation in the comparison group. On the last point, you know, clustering, a lot of our trials involve clustering, and then we have to do power calculations, which means estimating something about the degree of clustering. Oftentimes that's difficult to do, and it pays to talk to other people who've done trials who can give you some idea of how much clustering you might expect. And it's important that, as ANH Academy is tried to do, is to building a community of people who can share this kind of knowledge with each other is really important. Anything you want to add, Jeff?
No, that was good. And I mean, there is more we can add on all of these points, but I want to make sure that we take some time to address any questions that may have come from our presentation. So I'm handing it over to Shelley to lead the Q&A.
Thanks, Jeff. So we did have several questions come in during the presentation of the slides, and Talia had a comment more than a question, so I'll just summarize it here for those who weren't able to see it in the chat. When Jeff was talking about the difficulty of attributing effect to an intervention, Talia commented, isn't this because we have no confidence in the quality and fidelity of the delivery of the intervention because we don't really measure intervention delivery very well historically? So more of a comment than a question, unless Jeff or Ed, you want to say anything about that?
I have been involved in studying, and we've tried hard to not just measure the outcomes, but also to look at the fidelity, the strength of the actual implementation, which requires often a combination of qualitative and quantitative methods. So it's an important thing to assess if you want to draw meaningful conclusions.
Yeah, I would just add, I agree very much with the sentiment of the comment that if we design an intervention and we don't really make an effort to implement it well, or aren't able to acquire the knowledge ahead of time about how it can be implemented well, then we're really not helping, and we're using a lot of resources and not really gaining much out of it. I mean, we know that there's all kinds of things that can happen in real life. That certainly happened in our Kenya study, and especially in the larger one. But still, the team had access to information, and we were able to still say a lot about what happened, despite climate issues and other things that happened during the course of the study. So very much in agreement about the importance of trying to implement well and trying to assess the implementation.
Thank you.
And being
Thank you,
transparent about it.
Great. Thanks, Talia, for that comment. Next question is from Noelle. She's not clear on how one distinguishes between improved versus may have improved. Is this just semantics, or is there a statistical basis for this distinction?
You can hear me, right? Yeah, I'm not muted. So it goes beyond semantics. It reflects the certainty of the conclusion. The issue is that if you declare before you start the trial what you will assess, and then you report on all of these outcomes carefully, you can make very strong, solid conclusions about the effect of the intervention. If you report now on outcomes that you didn't declare beforehand, I as a reader don't know if you maybe looked at 75 different outcomes on your computer with your curtains drawn so nobody could see you, and you found an effect on 3 of those, and that's what you put in your article and reported on. So that's why that certainty is lower, because nobody knows what the underlying process was to come to those conclusions. So that's why the strength of that evidence should be rated lower than if you had declared the outcomes before the trial started.
Okay. Ed, anything you want to add?
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think the motivation for much of the guidance that originated even for simple or non-complex interventions was very much about what Jeff is talking about: transparency, which then gives those of us who then are positioned to read and use research results, gives us the confidence that when someone says we found an effect, that yes, that we're pretty darn confident that that's an effect we can count on. So that's what this is all about. And so I think what we're suggesting here is that the specific guidance that's out there for non-complex interventions about how to achieve that transparency is too strict and doesn't serve our purpose as well. But what Jeff presented was an alternative that tries to balance between what does serve us well in terms of maximizing learning from complex interventions, evaluations of them, but at the same time still providing some principles for how we can achieve transparency and confidence.
Okay. Thank you. Diana asks, Jeff, when you talked about multiplicity corrections, do you also refer to multiple comparisons adjustments, for example, the Bonferroni, or only to the planning of the intervention?
So multiplicity correction or multiple comparison correction, or what we often refer to as Bonferroni, it's all the same. And that could happen when you plan the trial. You say, oops, I'm measuring different outcomes and I will have a very strict reviewer, so I should power my study to allow me to do that correction when the data come in. That's one approach. Or it could be at the end of the trial, it's like, oh, gee whiz, what happened? I forgot to, I need to control for this. So it could happen then as well. The point we're trying to make is that it's costly, and we do not think it's necessary in the context of what we're trying to accomplish here.
Right. But to just make sure we're specific about it, we were talking about the circumstance of having multiple outcomes, multiple constructs of interest and outcomes that reflect those. There are other circumstances. For example, there's a long history in agriculture, going back almost 100 years now, about exploratory studies that are randomized, but they're exploratories trying to find which variety of wheat or something gives the most yield, where lots of them are tried, and then really an exploratory analysis is done. There, in the 50s especially, statisticians started inventing solutions for that particular circumstance, where there's many different arms being compared, and it's intended to be exploratory. That's not the situation we're talking about here. We're talking about a situation where the multiple outcomes arise because we have a complex theory of change, and we're interested in the outcomes along that theory of change. Bonferroni is just one method. It happens to be a common one. It happens to be very conservative, and so it has the issues that Jeff talked about in terms of really sacrificing our ability to see things in the name of trying to make an adjustment, which we're arguing we don't need to make if we're being transparent in the ways that we've suggested.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Noel. How can we formally address or report impact pathways and outcomes that are discovered during the trial and not predetermined?
Yeah, I can start. We were strict, and I think it's important to kind of drive home the message that we need to tell the world before we start these trials what we will be doing. But it would obviously be silly to not be open to what you discover during the implementation period of your intervention, where you discover people are behaving this way, they're doing that, or we forgot about that outcome and we should measure it anyway, even if it was not registered. I think it's important to do that, but when you then go and publish your results, you should just make it clear to the reader that this is an outcome that was added based on growing insights while you were doing the study, and that the certainty around the effect on that outcome should be rated differently than the certainty around the effects of outcomes that you did declare. We shouldn't forget that we're in this business to learn, to accumulate evidence that then can be used by others to implement better programs. And as long as we're perfectly transparent about what we do and how we go about it, I do not think there is limitations as to what outcomes you can report on. Let it just be known to everybody that it was an afterthought and you decided it was important to measure it anyway.
Anything you want to add, Ed?
No, perfect.
Okay. Diana, so multiplicity still a topic of great interest. She adds, would you suggest using multiple comparison corrections when doing sensitivity analysis?
If by sensitivity analysis is meant using an alternative analytic method, or I don't know, one could even imagine a situation where you have 3 or 4 measures of mental health, for example, and you've decided one of them is the one that you're really going to use as the important outcome because it best reflects the construct that you have in mind, but you do a sensitivity analysis looking at the other ones to see if you get congruence. I think then to me, it's already clear that what you're doing, it's a sensitivity analysis and you're looking for congruence. and it's meant to be supportive and helping to either increase or decrease our confidence, because if it's congruent, we'll increase confidence, and if it's not congruent, we're not. I think as long as you're transparent about it, I don't see why there's a multiple comparison issue there at all.
Okay. Jeff, anything you want to add?
Perfect answer.
Good that I get some internal validation here. So Noel, back to multiplicity. How do you respond to grant reviewers who require multiplicity correction? Have they been receptive to the approach you described today? So how openly accepted are these views that you have put forth?
We have not talked to all grant reviewers about what we're doing, so I can't give a solid answer to that question. I agree that for some reviewers, not just for grants, but also for papers, I think this might come as a bit controversial. At the same time, as Ed mentioned before, what we draw from is literature that is available. We have not invented anything new, I think. There's a large literature on multiplicity basically stating what we shared today, that for the purposes we have in mind here, that it's not a very meaningful thing to do. That's not a direct answer to your question. I think it will take some time for these ideas to become more common practice. And I obviously hope it doesn't take too long. But Ed, you must have additions to.
Well, you know, in my career, only one time did an editor and reviewers force a multiplicity correction, and so in all the things I've been a co-author on, that's the only one that appears when a multiplicity correction. In that particular case, it was particularly galling because that was a circumstance where everything was declared up front. So I think that so I haven't personally experienced a lot of super dogmatic thinking about it, but it is on people's minds. I think the closer to we publish in health journals, the more likely this is to be an issue, because it's normative in health journals where there's medical treatments being reported that people think about this according to you know, the guidance for non-complex interventions, and there's more of a norm for expecting multiplicity. I think that's less so in nutrition for sure, and you know, less so in agriculture and in other fields. So I think some of this is under our control by where we choose to publish. As you know, we said before, there is a vibrant literature out there. One particular really nice two companion articles in The Lancet that argues very forcefully that multiplicity is nonsensical in the ways we've talked about it. And so you can try to cite that and try to push back.
Thank you. We are at time. We've got to just about all the questions. If you have a specific point on the presentation that your question was not addressed, I'm going to volunteer that you could reach out to Jeff or Ed or to me, and I can route the question appropriately. But thanks very much for your questions, and Ed and Jeff, thanks very much for the answers, and I'll turn it back over to Hallie.
Thanks, Shelley, and thank you, Ed and Jeff. I'm going to launch a feedback poll now. It would be great if you don't mind providing us a bit of feedback on how this session went. Thank you so much to our facilitators again for facilitating a really interesting and wonderful session. I just wanted to make everyone aware of the other learning labs that we have going on this week. You can visit our website to see those, and we hope to see you next week as well at the research conference. So if you haven't filled out that poll, it would be great if you wouldn't mind doing so. And thank you very much for joining.